Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah from Mormons. Today, I decided it's important for us to not underestimate how difficult the rest of this is going to be. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some things I touched on last time. I mentioned briefly last time about some of the issues as we proceed with the book of Isaiah. Well, I wanted to briefly just go through and explain in more detail now what we're doing and how we're going to do it, and why this is so much more difficult to go through the rest of Isaiah than what we've just been doing. And like I said last week, I mentioned it briefly, but I decided to just take a break. We're not going to do the next chapter. I'm just going to go through and mention this in more detail and explain why this is a little bit more difficult, why we can't really be as confident, actually, about what Isaiah meant as we proceed, and just kind of explain what's going on. So, to know that, we really have to know the history of the text of the Old Testament and of the book of Isaiah specifically, and how this works exactly for our discussion of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, and just Isaiah not in the Book of Mormon, which is the problem. So, Isaiah is a prophet, obviously from Judah. He's probably starts he starts in the year King Uzziah died. So in the 740s is when he's probably starting as a prophet. He dies maybe in the 690s or so BC, because remember it goes backwards, right? In BC to 80. So probably starts prophesying in the 640s, probably dies in 697 or thereabouts, when King Hezekiah's son Manasseh kills him, saws him in half with a wooden saw, something crazy like that. Anyway, or yeah, puts him in a log and saws him in half. Actually, we're pretty sure what happens to him. So kind of crazy. That's why sometimes in art he's holding a saw. That's why. Yeah, kind of crazy. So during this period, things are really crazy. The Assyrians are coming in, and there's a lot of problems. So Isaiah kind of responds to a lot of the problems that are going on in the Assyrian Empire, and trying to preemptively deal with some of the issues that he knows are going to come up. We see that back in chapter 7, we talked about that he was trying to talk the king out of doing some of the stupid stuff he was about to do. Well then, right around chapter 40, his audience kind of shifts. At the beginning, chapters 1 through 39, he's talking to people before the Assyrian Empire has come in. But after chapter 40, he's talking to a people that have been devastated, really, by the wars against the Assyrians. Because on the one hand, you've got a whole bunch of refugees coming down from the north, and he's addressing them. But also, he's addressing those who are refugees from their cities in Judah. When the Assyrians come down, they take out a huge number of cities in Judah. This isn't just in the Old Testament that we have this. We have this in the Assyrians' own records. That they came down and took out a huge number of cities in Judah, and didn't take Jerusalem, frankly, because God killed a whole bunch of the army, and then they went back home. So all these refugees are fleeing to Jerusalem from the north, from the 10 tribes, but also from all around Judah. So Isaiah helps these people kind of pick up the pieces. And that's very, very important. That's what Isaiah 40 through 55 is Isaiah kind of helping these people sort of pick up the pieces. So that's the stuff in Isaiah. Those are the parts of Isaiah written by Isaiah. Chapter 2 through 55, almost certainly, are by Isaiah. The Isaiah in Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah and those other kings. Okay? But then, later on, after the Assyrians come through, things go kind of well for Judah for a while, but then the Babylonians come through, remember? And then the Babylonians take everybody away into exile. And obviously, that's a huge problem for these people. they're not in their homelands. There's actually some discussion in the Old Testament as to whether or not you can actually worship your God on soil that is not the God's soil. They have this idea that gods are regional deities and you can only worship them in certain areas. And in fact, there are times, well, for example, in the Elisha story when Naaman comes in, right, and he sacrifices, or excuse me, he gets healed by Elisha, he takes soil back to his homeland from Israel so he can sacrifice to Jehovah there, because the idea is, well, Jehovah's got to be a regional deity, and how can I worship Jehovah on land that is not part of Jehovah's territory? So when people get taken away to Babylon, this is a huge problem for them. They go, well, is God a regional deity or isn't he? And they decide, well, no. Jehovah can't be a regional deity. Yeah, I can still worship him here, that's okay. But they have to still deal with a lot of the issues that they would have had to, that these other people during Isaiah's time would have needed to deal with. And that's important. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. So you have these two different parts of the book of Isaiah, 1 through 39, and then 40 through 55. And 40 through 55 is Isaiah trying to comfort these people and help them to realize that even though the Assyrians have caused major problems, everything's going to be okay. Then, like I said, after people get taken to Babylon and come back, people realize that Isaiah is suddenly very, very relevant to them. All these things that he was talking about with the Assyrian Empire, all these different issues he was bringing up to help people to handle what had happened when the Assyrians came in, they realized, well, this is very similar to what we're going through right now with the Babylonians. And so they kind of applied the book of Isaiah to their own time. You'll notice that this is the inclination of people that have gone through this experience. Nephi and Jacob do the same thing. In 2 Nephi 11:2 it says, "And now I, Nephi, write more of the words of Isaiah, for my soul delighteth in his words. For I will liken his words unto my people, and I will send them forth unto all my children. For he verily saw my Redeemer, even as I have seen him." So Nephi, when he's dealing with this, trying to deal with the Babylonian captivity, even though he's fleeing just before it happens, he still has to grapple with the issues, and he turns to Isaiah to take care of the issues. Now, one reason that he turns to Isaiah is because Isaiah has seen the Lord, right? We know that from Isaiah chapter 6. And so he turns to Isaiah for that before he begins his long series of quotations. But that's one thing that we have to remember, is that this is not what happens in the Book of Mormon. People turn to Isaiah for comfort is probably not so strange as to what would have happened in the Old Testament. So people in the Babylonian captivity are also turning to Isaiah and saying, hey, this is very similar to what we're going through right now. And so they, because you'll notice, the early part of Isaiah, which scholars call Proto-Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39 are called Proto-Isaiah because it's the first part of the book of Isaiah. That is quoted a lot in the Book of Mormon, rather chapters 2 through 39. And then also, though, parts from chapter 40 to 55, which scholars call Deutero-Isaiah, are also quoted a lot in the Book of Mormon. So we can see that the idea of destruction is going to come upon you is something that they draw from, but also comfort after this destruction is something that they need. And so they draw from both of these parts of the book of Isaiah. So, but what about chapters 56 through 66? Because probably chapter 2 through 55 is by Isaiah of Jerusalem. What about the rest? What about chapter 1? What about chapter 56 through 66? Well, probably what happened is, when people come back from Babylon, they turn to Isaiah for comfort. Like I said, they're reading it. They realize that he's really talking about what they've just been through. But somebody needs to distribute it. It needs to become more widely available. And so, during this period, somebody, and I think personally, that it was Zechariah. That's just me having a hunch. There's small linguistic similarities, not enough, not any kind of smoking gun, just enough to say maybe this is Zechariah. If it isn't Zechariah, it's somebody very much like Zechariah doing this. Okay, so this person, a prophet, Zechariah, or somebody like him, somebody much like Nephi, has gone through and written an introduction and conclusion for the book of Isaiah, chapter 1 and chapters 56 through 66. Now, before you throw up your hands and cry foul, notice that Nephi and Jacob are doing the same thing in the book of Mormon. I just read that in chapter 2. Nephi says, and now I'm going to quote a bunch of Isaiah, which he does for the next quite a few chapters. And he writes a short introduction. That's what chapter 11 of 2nd Nephi is. His short introduction to the book of Isaiah. And he talks about things that make Isaiah so great. Number one, Isaiah saw the Redeemer, just like he and Jacob have. Also, it demonstrates things about the coming of Christ and helps them to apply the law of Moses. Also, it talks about the covenants of the Lord and the power of God's grace and the resurrection. And it also demonstrates that except Christ should come, all men must perish. That's what it says in 2 Nephi 11:6. Also, it's supposed to illustrate that there is a God and illustrate the power of God. And it says that this should make people rejoice. And now I'm going to read it to you, and you should liken it to yourselves. So this is an introduction that he gives to the book of Isaiah. Then he reads a huge swath starting at what was probably the beginning for him, starting in chapter 2, going all the way to the end. And then he writes a conclusion. That's what 2 Nephi 25 is. Going back to 2 Nephi 25:1, it says, Now I, Nephi, do speak somewhat concerning the words which I have written, which have been spoken by the mouth of Isaiah. For behold, Isaiah spake many things which were hard for many of my people to understand, for they know not concerning the manner of prophesying among the Jews. And so he continues to explain, yeah, this is kind of hard. Let me explain what I just read, and apply it to the people in his own time period. So here in the Book of Mormon, we have somebody, a prophet, writing an introduction and a conclusion to Isaiah, with huge swaths of Isaiah inserted into the middle. Now, it seems very reasonable and very likely to me that in the captivity, as people are coming back, there aren't going to be that many copies of the book of Isaiah. It's not like people, when the Babylonians come to town, are going to be able to grab, 10 Isaiah scrolls and get out of town when the Babylonians come in. You grab one if you're lucky, right? We probably lost a huge amount of scripture when the Babylonians came in. So, they grab maybe one copy, get out, maybe they make some copies in the exile, but there are not going to be that many floating around. So, one of these prophets, and like I said, my hunch is Zechariah, but it's impossible to prove that, takes this, writes an introduction and conclusion, what we now know is chapter 1 and chapters 55 through 56 through 66 of Isaiah, and distributes it. Okay? Then, and this is not just, this is some things I've been able to figure out because of the Book of Mormon, and also taking the Book of Mormon and pairing that with the best of modern scholarship on the book of Isaiah. This is the picture I've been able to put together. I'm going to tell you the picture of what most scholars think as soon as I'm done here, and tell you why I think that's probably not right. But this is the picture I've been able to sort of put together. So this prophet writes an introduction, chapter 1, and then a conclusion, chapters 55 through 66, or 56 through 66 of Isaiah, giving you something very much like what we see here in the Book of Mormon. Instead of just a few chapters, we get the entire book with a prophetic introduction and conclusion applied to that time period. But you say, Nephi very clearly states, and now I'm going to start quoting Isaiah. Why doesn't this guy? And he's at the end he says, and now this is me. This is not Isaiah anymore, right? So why doesn't this guy do it? Isn't that dishonest of him to write an introduction and conclusion and then not say anything about it? Well, my assumption is that this guy, maybe Zechariah, but who knows, wrote this introduction and conclusion and made it very clear that it was an introduction and conclusion written by him. But you know how when we went through the Book of Mormon and we noticed that there were these funny little tiny changes, a phrase here taken out, a phrase there thrown in, a line changed here, a few words changed there. That's this third editor, okay? He changes little things that actually make a big difference. We noticed that, right, when we were going through this. Little, small changes make a big difference, and that's this third editor's MO. Little changes, okay? I don't think that this is the second guy. I think that you have Isaiah, you have this other guy who writes chapter 1 and then the conclusion, and then you have editor number 3, who frankly I don't like very much. You can tell the editor number 3 is he lives way after Isaiah. He doesn't understand some of the words Isaiah is using, so he changes them. When you compare Second Nephi, the material in Second Nephi, to the Hebrew Bible, you can tell this editor sometimes doesn't understand what Isaiah is saying because he's using much later versions of some words. In Hebrew and indeed in all languages that I'm aware of, words can change meanings over time. So that you can look at a document written in one period and a document written in another period, and you can tell usually by the way the words are used when it was written. Okay. So this guy, this third editor who's making all these changes, is clearly from a later period because he doesn't understand the words Isaiah is using and the way that he's using them. He understands them to mean something slightly different, what they would have meant later on in the history of Hebrew. Okay, so that leaves us with a guy who's making small changes. So what does that imply? Probably this guy who wrote chapter 1 and chapter 56 to 66 wrote that, and now this is Isaiah, right? This is my introduction. Here's some Isaiah. Now I'm going to comment some more and apply it to you guys, you reprobates who I'm talking to, right? But our dear friend, editor number 3, probably didn't get that. He didn't understand it, or he didn't think it mattered. And so he just pulled out those notes, making it look like it was one coherent piece, when really it's not. Now, this is a combination, like I said, of evidence from the Book of Mormon as well as evidence from the best Isaiah scholarship. Most Isaiah scholars put chapter 1 in with the rest of the book of Isaiah and don't think that it's a later addition, but let me tell you why I think so. Chapter 1 and chapter 66 are very similar. We'll get to that when we get to the end. But chapter 1 and chapter 6 are very similar. Theme, style, word choice, you name it, they're basically the same. And this is the most important point. Chapter 1 does not appear in the Book of Mormon. When Nephi says, and now I, Nephi, write more of the words of Isaiah, he starts with chapter 2. And let's just read chapter 2. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. That's how it starts. That would be the perfect beginning for a book. Right? There's nothing strange about that being the beginning of the book of Isaiah. It identifies Isaiah. Since you don't know who Isaiah is, it gives you his family, the son of Amos. And it says, this is what Isaiah saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. But let's look at chapter 1 of the book of Isaiah for a second. They're similar, but it's just a little bit different. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Now, we just had an introduction to the book in chapter 2. Why do we have an introduction in chapter 1? Another one. It doesn't make much sense. Well, let's look more carefully at this introduction. It says the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of these 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. But why does he have to say it's in the days of these kings? Everybody knows at the time of Isaiah's life, everybody knows what kings he's working under. But later, after the Babylonian exile, when this other prophet is writing his introduction and conclusion, he may have needed to remind people, by the way, you remember Isaiah, he lived during the reigns of these kings. You remember? Okay, that's this guy, right? He would need to do something like that. Okay, so that evidence, the doubling of the introduction, as well as the fact that Isaiah number 1 is never quoted, they jump straight into chapter 2 in the Book of Mormon. Those two things make me say it's very likely that Isaiah originally wrote Isaiah chapter 2 through Isaiah chapter 55, and that somebody else, another prophet, wrote chapter 1 and then chapter 56 through the end. Now, and like I said, we shouldn't be upset about this. We shouldn't throw up our hands and cry foul. Yes, somebody deceived us. Editor number 3, who I don't like. And he's the reason we're going to have a lot of problems from here on out. Is because he changes little tiny things here and there. Okay, and so we're going to have some problems with him. But the guy himself who wrote chapter 1, and the guy who wrote chapter, the same guy, presumably, who wrote chapter 56 to the end, is great. So, really, what we have to deal with is who I identify as editor number 3, who, like I said, is much later in history. So we have to try to figure out what he was doing, and sometimes we aren't going to be able to tell, because like I said, these changes are so small, it's hard to see what this editor is doing in order to get the best version of the text. Now, my assessment of the 2 authors and then a 3rd editor for Isaiah is not what most scholars think, because quite frankly, most Isaiah scholars don't have the advantage of having the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is an absolutely critical element in trying to figure out Isaiah. Since most scholars don't have it, they do the best with what they have. So most scholars think that Isaiah is just written by 3 different people. There's no editing, stuff, just 3 different people. They think that Isaiah wrote chapters 1 through 39. They think this guy so they call him Proto-Isaiah, first Isaiah. They think that Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah, wrote chapters 40 through 55 in Babylon during the Babylonian exile. Then they think that a 3rd author wrote Isaiah 56 through 66. Now, their assessment about Isaiah 56 through 66 is borne out by the Book of Mormon. Isaiah 1, like I said, they kind of missed that. But Isaiah 56 through 66 is never quoted in the Book of Mormon ever. As far as I can tell, I've combed the Book of Mormon pretty carefully looking for Isaiah 56 to 66 quotations. There are none, as far as I can tell. So, Isaiah quotations in the Book of Mormon only occur between chapters 2 and chapters 55. What does that tell us? I think it tells us that that's the original book of Isaiah. Chapter 2, chapter 55. Chapter 1, and then the rest, probably by somebody else. But like I said, most scholars don't have this advantage. So, all they can go on is style. Chapter 1 through 39 does have a similar style. So they say this is Proto-Isaiah, this is actually Isaiah who lived in Jerusalem under Hezekiah. 40 through 55 is during the exile because of the style, but mostly because of who it addresses. There are some very specific things that talk about the Babylonian captivity in chapters 40 through 55. So why don't I think that this was written during the exile? And the answer is, it shows up in the Book of Mormon. Material from chapters 40 through 55 show up in the Book of Mormon, which means that it has to have been written before Lehi left Jerusalem. The brass plates give us a solid date for once in our lives. We actually have a solid date for something, and that is that This was written, the brass plates are written before 600 BC. Even if Zoram is frantically writing the night that he gets taken away, that puts you right around 600 BC, and I doubt Zoram is adding anything to the brass plates the night he leaves. So that gives you a solid date, which means that almost definitely 2 through 55 are by Isaiah. However, like I said, most scholars don't have the Book of Mormon, so they say, well, yeah, this seems to be talking to people who are in captivity, waiting to return. But you have to remember, Isaiah is talking to people from the north and from various cities of Judah that have been destroyed, and they can't go back to their homes. The people from the north can't go back to their homes because they'd be leaving their country, they'd be entering the Assyrian Empire. So they can't return, they are in exile. And also these other people, their homes are smoldering piles of rubble and most of their families dead. Are they really going to return to their homes either? Some of them will, but a lot of them won't. So Isaiah is indeed talking to an exilic audience. It's just not the Babylonian exile, it's the Assyrian exile. That's why there is a shift in subject matter starting right around chapter 40. Their divisions aren't perfect, we'll talk about that. But there is that division in subject matter. Why? Because he really is addressing a different audience at that point. But third editor rears his ugly head. Mr. Third Editor came in and he changed a bunch of stuff about the Assyrian captivity to specifically apply to the Babylonian captivity. Yeah, the second guy who came in, he wrote an introduction and conclusion just to get you in the mindset of, by the way, you should be applying this to the Babylonian captivity. Third editor, he doesn't care. He straight up changes stuff to make it look like it's the Babylonian captivity. That's why you get stuff that looks like it's absolutely Babylonian captivity stuff in that second part of Isaiah, in Deutero-Isaiah. Without the Book of Mormon, there would be no reason to assume that this is anything but something written during the exile. But because of the Book of Mormon, we know that no, it can't be written during the exile because we have stuff from between chapters 40 and 55 in the brass plates, meaning has to have been written by Isaiah. So, but it makes sense. Isaiah is talking to people suffering from problems that happened because of the Assyrians. Mr. Third Editor comes in and applies that to the Babylonians. And so, that leaves you with the three sections that most scholars think. Proto-Isaiah, chapter 1 through 39, written by Isaiah himself. 40 through 55, written by Deutero-Isaiah during the exile. And chapters 56 through 66, written after the exile. Now, my belief and the belief of the modern scholars lines up with what's called Trito-Isaiah or Third Isaiah. It does definitely seem to be somebody after the exile. But it's not like this is a dishonest thing originally. This is probably somebody who I identify as the second person, the prophet who comes in and writes the introduction and conclusion. They see as the last person. So there's what probably is three people in real life: Isaiah, the prophet who writes chapters 2 through 55, the prophet who writes the introduction and conclusion, chapter 1 and 56 through 66, and then the third guy who edits it, and edits it badly, in my opinion, and we're going to have to deal with his mess for the rest of this book. That's all right. We'll deal with it. Now, like I said, most scholars, however, see it as Proto-Isaiah, Isaiah who wrote, Isaiah the man himself, wrote chapter 1 through 39. Deutero-Isaiah, somebody in the exile, writing chapter 40 through 55. And then Trito-Isaiah, writing chapter 56 through 66. So, because of the Book of Mormon, we see things a little bit differently than the modern scholars do. So when I talk about Isaiah, in the rest of this conversation, the rest of this series, I'm going to be talking about Isaiah the man himself. He wrote chapters 2 through 55 of the book of Isaiah. When I talk about the second Isaiah, I'm going to be talking about the guy who wrote, well, I may just call him Trito Isaiah because that's what everyone else calls him. But I'll probably just call him the prophet. Okay, so we have the prophet who wrote chapter 1 and then 56 to the end. So we have Isaiah, we have the prophet, and then we have Mr. Third Editor who comes in and messes a bunch of stuff up. Okay, so I've given you what most scholars think, and I've given you what I think is a reasonable assumption based on the text of the Book of Mormon. So, you're probably asking yourself at this point, well, if Mr. Third Editor has come in and messed up a bunch of stuff, what are we going to do? Isaiah 2 through 2 through about 14 was fine because we have the Book of Mormon. No problem. What are we going to do without the Book of Mormon? And that's an excellent question. The answer is we're just going to have to kind of do it the old-fashioned way. When it comes to the text of the Old Testament, there are three major sources that we go to figure out what's going on. One is called the Masoretic text. This is the standard text of the Hebrew Old Testament that is the basis of our King James Version of the Bible. It's kind of the standard. It's called the Masoretic text after the guys who kind of put it together and kind of did that final edit job. Okay, so Masoretic text. Then there is the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It was made probably in Alexandria, Egypt, but it's pretty old. The Septuagint is pretty old. And so, it's made during the Hellenistic period, right? Because Alexander the Great comes down, the Greeks come in after the Babylonians and the Persians. Okay, maybe kind of drawing this out of the memory here. The Babylonians take everybody away. The Persians allow everybody to come home and rebuild the temple, right? You're remembering this from history class, I think. Then the Greeks come in. They take out the Middle East. And so a lot of people in the Middle East and a lot of North Africa speak Greek. So the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, make a Greek translation of the Old Testament to help them and other Greek speakers read the Old Testament. But that translation is pretty old, and so that gives us another possible resource to look at when we're dealing with the Old Testament, because you have slightly different versions. It's not just that it's translated into Greek. If it were just the standard text translated into Greek, it wouldn't matter much. But probably they have a different version that they translate into Greek, and then there's the other version that becomes the standardized Hebrew text. So we can actually, even though it's in Greek, we can kind of translate it back into Hebrew in our heads and then compare two slightly different Hebrew versions side by side, which is very useful. Then the third thing we use is the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've mentioned that on a number of occasions. The Dead Sea Scrolls probably date to around 150 BC if you're lucky, the Isaiah scroll. So it's old. It's really old. It's a lot older than the Masoretic text, but it's unfortunately not nearly as old as the Book of Mormon, and it is slightly newer than the Septuagint probably, but the Septuagint version is in Greek, right? So no matter what you do, you have some problems at this point. But between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, we can try to piece together what the best version of Isaiah would have looked like. We can also take cues from the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon doesn't just stop with this huge chunk of Isaiah that's been quoted. They will allude to Isaiah consistently throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon. And so, and there are still a few whole chapters that are just straight up quoted. Isaiah 53, one of Isaiah 52, a few others like that. Thankfully also, we do sometimes actually get Joseph Smith translation for this. Isaiah 29, we get Joseph Smith translation. Thankfully. So we will be able to use the Book of Mormon as we continue, just not as much as we have, and quite frankly, not as much as I would like. So we're going to have to take these different versions and piece them together and try to figure out what's going on. So it's going to be kind of slow going, but I think that it'll end up well. So I know that this is kind of drinking through a fire hose, so let me just review one more time. Most scholars divide Isaiah into 3 sections, and those sections are 1 through 39, 40 through 55, and 56 through 66, assuming that these are all written by different authors. Because of the Book of Mormon, we know that this is not correct. Chapters 2 through 55 are indeed written by Isaiah. Chapter 1 and 56 through 66 are written by another prophet at some point, probably Zechariah. That's based on the Book of Mormon. That's, I think, a very safe assumption. Then somebody else came through and edited it a whole bunch. So what we need to do now, and what I'll be doing for the rest of the time, is trying to deal with this guy's editing job, get to the text of Isaiah as much as possible, and work through the rest of the book, dealing with egregious violations by editor number 3 when we come to him. So anyway, that's really what we're doing here. The way I'm going to be doing it is I'm going to be using the text of the Book of Mormon when I have it, but mostly I'll be comparing the 3 versions, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, the Greek version, and the standard Masoretic text, which is just the standard Hebrew text. I'll be comparing those versions, and we're just going to see what we can do. Because of the benefit of the Book of Mormon, I think we'll be able to do some really good things, and to be able to answer questions that other people have not been able to figure out. So, if you're wondering why Isaiah is so difficult, chapters 2 through 14 are difficult, even a little difficult even in the Book of Mormon. The rest is going to be even more difficult. Why? Because of this bad editing job. So don't feel bad when you read it and you don't necessarily get it, because it is a bad editing job. And I'm going to do the best I can to help to cut through that bad editing job and make sense of this. So anyway, that's some history about authorship and textual issues, and we'll jump into the text later. So we will see you guys next time.